Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our seminar this evening, our webinar. My name is Mark Lazarovich, and I am the chair of the European Movement in Scotland. European Movement in Scotland is a broad-based members organisation which is committed to Scotland playing its part in the wider European community. Since the Brexit referendum, our focus has, was of course, first of all, in putting the case for Scotland and the whole UK to remain in the EU. Now that we've left, we want to see Scotland maintaining and strengthening its link to the rest of Europe and becoming part of the European Union again. Now, of course, that could come about by the UK itself joining the EU again and Scotland being part of it, or of course, it could be by an independent Scotland joining the EU as a sovereign state. And that, of course, is the topic, the subject of our discussion today. Now, as an organisation, we don't have a position on Scottish independence. Some of our members are in favour, some are against, others have changed their minds since the referendum, and others are, I'm sure, undecided on the issue. But we certainly recognise, whatever our individual views are, that the issue and the question of how Scotland could become a member of the European Union again, if it was an independent state, is very much at the centre of political debate in Scotland now and is likely to be for some time to come. So that is why we thought it was important to have this event today, to join in the organisation, and we're grateful to our speakers and to all you who are joining us tonight for what I'm sure is going to be a very good discussion indeed. As well as ourselves as the sponsors of this event, we are joined by the Scottish Centre on European Relations, which is Scotland's leading think tank on European issues. And one of our speakers tonight will be their director, Kirsty Hughes, and our moderator for tonight's discussion will say a bit more about Kirsty later, but we're delighted that the Scottish Centre on European Relations is one of the co-sponsors, and excellent work in these issues for those of you who want to look more into the questions we're raising tonight. And our third sponsor for the event this evening will be the Faculty of Advocates, which has played an active part in the European legal and policy community since during the UK's membership of the European Union, and continues to do so even after Brexit. And indeed, the original idea of today's webinar came from one of the leading members of the Faculty of Advocates, Ronnie Clancy QC, who will be moderating the discussion later on and the question and answer session. And those are our two other co-sponsors. And as well as Kirsty is one of the speakers, our other speakers will be Professor Tobias Locke from Maynooth University in Dublin, from Berlin, Dr. Barbara Lippert, the Director of Studies at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin, and from the London School of Economics, Professor James Ker-Lindsay. And Ronnie Clancy, our moderator, will say a few more words in introduction about the speakers when he takes over the running of the webinar tonight. Just a few introductions or explanations about the arrangements on Zoom. Many of you will, I'm sure, have taken part in Zoom events over the last 1 year almost now, since we entered this new world. But just a few more explanations, because we've got a lot of people joining in the webinar tonight. I should explain that the only people you will see on the screen will be the various speakers when they speak, and they will be the only people who will be participating as speaking in tonight's event. But we're very keen to have as much opportunity for participation by you, the people who are taking part as participants in the event tonight. So there'll be a lot of time for questions and answers. If you want to put a question to the panel, then we suggest you use the question and answer facility. If you move your cursor to the bottom of your screen or the side, depending on what type of equipment you're using to access the webinar tonight, you should click on the Q&A section, and you should then put your question then, and Ronnie will try and get through as many as possible. But of course, with 300 or 400 people, we will not cover every question, but I know he will try and do what he can to cover all the themes that are raised. There's also, some of you will be aware, a chat facility where you can also chat with other participants or speakers. I should say, given the numbers, I doubt very much whether any of the speakers or the chair or the moderator will be able to look closely at the chat function, but it is there if you want to use it. But I would recommend if you have a question or to ask, then use the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. So those are the technical arrangements. We have a seminar till just about 7 o'clock. I'll say a few words at the end, and also would mention at the end of the seminar, you will have a screen coming up, which will again give the details of how to get involved in the European movement in Scotland. And you will also receive, 10 minutes after the seminar closes, a survey, which would be very grateful if you would respond to give us your reaction to today's event, and to let us know perhaps if you want to become involved in other activities in the future. But with that, thank you again for taking part as participants by joining in the seminar tonight. Thank you in advance to our speakers, and over to Ronnie Clancy, who will now take over moderating the rest of the webinar. Ronnie, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Mark, and good evening to all our audience members. It is my pleasure to introduce the first of our 4 speakers this evening. He is Professor Tobias Locke. Tobias holds a Jean Monnet Chair in European Union Law and Fundamental Rights at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth. He has held that post since last year. Prior to that, he was the senior lecturer and co-director of the Europa Institute at Edinburgh Law School, and he has held positions at the University of Surrey, University College London, and the University of Erlangen in Germany. Tobias was an advisor in European Union constitutional law to the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee of the Scottish Parliament from 2019 to 2020, and a member of the First Minister's Advisory Group on Human Rights Leadership. He's currently a member of the Academic Advisory Panel of the National Task Force for Human Rights Leadership, and a member of the ARINS project, that's Analysing and Researching Ireland North and South, of the Royal Irish Academy, no less. Tobias has published widely on EU and comparative constitutional law and fundamental rights law. And his topic for this evening is legal issues around accession. And before I hand over to Tobias, can I just mention that we would welcome questions from the audience for all our speakers. But we're going to deal with them all at the end after we've heard from all 4 speakers, rather than at the end of each individual contribution. So feel free to get these posted on the Q&A box, and we'll make a selection when we get to that section. And with that, Tobias, welcome. The screen is all yours.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back in Edinburgh, even if it's just virtually. I'll try to share my screen now, which never normally works, so bear with me. I hope you can see that. So I just want to briefly talk about the legal issues around an accession of an independent Scotland to the EU, which is, of course, not only it's predominantly a political process, but it is also a legal process, and certain steps have to be taken. And I will end with a few questions, which we may or may not be able to answer. Now, the law is set out in Article 49 of the Treaty on European Union, and it's fairly straightforward. If you skim read it, I've highlighted the relevant bits for you. You need to be a European state if you want to become an EU member state. Now, Scotland, an independent Scotland, would certainly fulfill that criterion, and you have to respect the values referred to in Article 2 of the TEU, and you must be committed to promoting them. And Article 2 of the TEU tells us what these values are, and in a nutshell, they are respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and so on and so on. Basically, the attributes of a liberal democracy as we know it. Now, assuming that Scotland an independent Scotland would fulfill those requirements, and I think we can assume that, then we come to the process. The process is one in which the prospective member state must negotiate an accession with the EU. And that's where things get a bit more tricky. If you look at the purple bit here, where it says the conditions of eligibility agreed upon by the European Council shall be taken into account, well, that is the meaty bit. That's what you really have to fulfill. And I'll come back to that in a second. Now, simply on process, the application is decided on by the Council, that is the member states, and they have to act unanimously. That means every member state has to agree to a request of Scotland to become an EU member state. That means, conversely, that every member state also has a veto. And you also need the consent of the European Parliament. In technical terms, this then leads to, if we have consent and if everything is negotiated, we have an agreement, which is a treaty between the prospective member state, that would be an independent Scotland, and the other member states, and that then needs to be ratified, so that may take some time, and off you go, you're back in the EU. Now, let's have a look at those bits in purple, because they are often referred to, those criteria formulated by the European Council are the so-called Copenhagen Criteria, named after the place where they were concocted in Copenhagen in, I think, 1993. So you've got three key criteria. You've got the political criteria that we looked at, the values of the EU and so on, respect for democracy. You've got certain economic criteria where an independent Scotland would have to have a functioning market economy and the capacity to cope with competition market forces. Now, we can assume that an independent Scotland would opt to have a market economy. It would also have to have this capacity to cope with competition market forces. So it would have to have a competition authority and all those paraphernalia that come with a market economy, with a functioning one. And then comes the snag, and that is the adoption of the entire EU acquis, and that is shorthand or EU speak for the adoption of the entirety of EU law as it stands at the time of accession. So the country that is always the most up-to-date with EU law, with implementation and transposition of EU law, is usually the one that has just acceded to the EU, because they had to fulfill those criteria on accession day. Now, the entire EU acquis, that's EU legislation on, the internal market, EU cooperation between courts, judicial cooperation, and so on and so on. So all of that stuff. But crucially, and maybe problematically, we come back to that maybe in a minute, and certainly in the discussion. This includes a commitment to economic and monetary union, which is means the final step of that is accession to the euro, adoption of the euro as a currency. It also includes a commitment to Schengen, which is an initial commitment, which is then followed up once a state has acceded to the EU and once it fulfills additional criteria in terms of border checks and its visa regime and all of that, with full admission to the Schengen zone. At the moment, we've got most EU member states in Schengen except 4, and those are the latest members, which are Croatia, Bulgaria, Romania, and also Cyprus. They're still out of the Schengen zone for the time being, but they want to become parties to it. So that is a core commitment of EU membership. And then that's it. Now, the accession negotiation happens, what the EU Commission calls in 35 chapters. It happens technically at a level between the accession country, candidate country, and the European Commission. And once you've ticked all those boxes, all 35 chapters have been negotiated, and the Commission is satisfied that the accession country fulfills all the criteria, then there is nothing, apart from obviously political obstacles, but legally speaking, there's nothing that is in the way of membership. Now, what is the timeline? Who knows? It's very, very difficult to say, and it's very difficult to say in the abstract. Now, there are different extremes in the history of EU membership. If we look at the latest accession, that was by Croatia, which became a member state in 2013, they became a candidate country in 2004. And so it took them around about 9 years to get to where they wanted to be. If we look at the fastest process, as far as I can tell, maybe there was a faster one, but of the more recent time, at least my lifetime, Austria, Sweden, and Finland, they became members in less than 2 years. Now, where would Scotland sit is a very good question. It would probably be, my guess would be closer to the Austria, Sweden, and Finland example, but not quite as fast, simply because this was a time, the early 90s, where there was simply a lot less EU law around, a lot less to be negotiated. And Austria, Sweden, and Finland were already in the European Economic Area, but much will depend, I think, upon how much time Scotland spends outside the EU orbit. And that's where we come to my key questions, as far as I can tell them at the moment, but maybe after this event, I will have even more, and I may have some answers. In terms of the timeline, I think one of the key questions will be, how far will Scotland have deviated from the EU acquis? Now, obviously, it is clear, I think, if I read the Scottish government's political position correctly, they want to stay as close as possible. But some of this is outside the Scottish government's hands. We have, of course, got areas of EU activity, many areas of EU activity that are simply not devolved. Look at employment law, for instance, but also look at a lot of economic law, broadly speaking. We have the Internal Market Act 2020, which may make it difficult for Scotland in certain cases to simply stick with the status quo. There might be an economic or political incentive to change laws, even if they are devolved. The next question, so the longer Scotland is outside the EU, the longer it might take it to find its way back in. The next question then is, does Scotland want to secure certain opt-outs from EU membership? And if so, is that realistic at all? Now, the UK had 3 key opt-outs during its membership. The euro, it was not part of the Economic and Monetary Union. The UK had an opt-out of much of the area of freedom, security and justice, AFSJ, that is EU criminal law and all that went along with it. The UK had a model of opting into that, which it had exercised in certain areas and not exercised in other areas. And finally, the UK had an opt-out of the Schengen zone of visa-free, border-less travel that we have in the EU. That, we can discuss. I think if Scotland wanted to secure opt-outs, it should realistically concentrate on the Schengen opt-out simply because of the border, and I'll come back to the border in a second. Would all EU member states agree to Scottish accession? Well, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see, but we'll probably explore that more now in the discussion. Is there any chance of a seamless transition into the EU, or would Scotland have to wait? Now, if you look back to 2013 and the white paper of the Scottish government just before the independence referendum, the Scottish government had this idea at the time that Scotland would vote for independence. It would then slowly transition out of the UK. There would be an Independence Day. And on that day, more or less, Scotland would also be able to assume its membership of the EU. Whether that was realistic back then, I don't know. At the moment, certainly Scotland, if it became independent, I think it would be outside the EU realistically. And then the question is, how long would it take? Well, that I have tried to answer more or less. I don't know. Simply, it would depend upon certain events that are happening now in the next couple of years. And the question then is, what should happen in between? Should Scotland go into the European Economic Area? Should Scotland conclude an association agreement with the EU? Should it not conclude any agreements with the EU and go straight for membership? All of these things would need to be discussed, and the advantages and disadvantages needed to be weighed. And finally, I think one of the key questions that need to be answered, and I think it's certainly that one of the things that Brexit has taught us, and you can see the no hard border sign is obviously not from Scotland, but it is from about 60 or 80 kilometers north of where I am. sitting at the moment. What should happen to the border between Scotland and England? Is there any chance of keeping that free-flowing and open? And in how far would that inform the choices that Scotland would make, both in terms of whether it wants to become an EU member state, when it wants to become an EU member state, and what kind of negotiating tactics it might want to employ, especially when it comes to a possible opt-out from Schengen, using the argument, of course, that Scotland is in the common travel area, just like Ireland, and Ireland has an opt-out from Schengen because it is in the common travel area. So all of these questions are there. There are definitely more, and I'm looking forward to discussing them with you in the next hour or so.
Tobias, thank you very much for that, for getting us off to a flying start. Please do not rest on your laurels, because the questions are already coming in, and we can promise you some challenging questions put straight to you when we finish with the other speakers. I'll move straight on to our second speaker now. We welcome Dr. Barbara Lippert. She is the Director of Research and a member of the Executive Board of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, which is part of the SWP Foundation in Berlin. She oversees the work of SWP's 8 research divisions. Her own research focus is on European integration. Before joining SWP in 2009, she was Deputy Director of the Institute for European Politics in Bonn and Berlin, and a lecturer at the universities in Cologne and Berlin. Dr. Lippert's areas of expertise are the political system of the EU, EU enlargement policy, European neighbourhood policy, and Germany's European policy. Barbara's talk this evening is on how the European Union sees enlargement in general and on likely responses to a Scottish application to join the EU. Barbara, welcome to virtual Scotland. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Thanks to the organizers for having me. I can build up on what Tobias introduced as topics and look at the questions first from an EU angle and add a bit of a political dimension. So what's the general attitude inside the European Union towards enlargement? I think one can say that most of the time, public opinion in the EU on enlargement has been rather lukewarm. There is neither strong opposition nor real enthusiasm. At best, people take a permissive attitude to enlargement, and it's also, for those who want to join, a bit of a problem that enlargement is not a top issue in domestic politics in most of the EU member states. So we can see from the polls that Finland, Luxembourg, Austria, the Netherlands, France, Germany, and Sweden, they hold a solid majority in the public against further enlargement. Greatest support is found in Poland, in Croatia, in Hungary, in Spain, in Romania, Lithuania, and notably also Ireland. And polls show that attitudes towards specific candidates confirm that some countries have better image than others. So Turkey is still the most controversial candidate, and its application is, to my mind, still not a totally dead case. So when talk is about enlargement, many, for example, in Germany, immediately think of Turkey, which spoils the show for other candidates. And as already Tobias mentioned, governments are crucial actors in the whole of the accession process. Every step, each and every step that is taken by unanimity in the Council. And we saw that when France was blocking the opening of negotiations for Albania, North Macedonia, Bulgaria is now doing the same. And that means from time to time also that the member states have to renew their consensus, of course, first established in Copenhagen decades ago, but they always have to sort out again what their political assessment also is. And we have still diverging views and, for example, also priorities that are set in the member states with regard to applications. But one can say that more or less in tune with the polls, there are countries that generally support enlargement. I would mention Spain, formerly, of course, the UK, and most of the Central and Eastern Europeans. But others are reluctant or very skeptical, like France and the Netherlands. Germany has always been a very active promoter of all rounds of enlargement from 1973 up to Croatia. But it has become, to my mind, more skeptical and concerned about strict conditionality in meeting the accession criteria. So the Copenhagen criteria are very, very important in all three parts. The Commission has, with, I would say, some success, tried to depoliticize the accession process, and that generally works in favor of candidates. But it has its downsides too when the political dimension and communication with the public is neglected. To make an accession bid run smoothly, it is important to develop a narrative for enlargement. A very powerful narrative presented by the EU for the Eastern enlargement was that membership of the Central and Eastern Europeans would mean to overcome Yalta, the division of Europe. So it had a very historic dimension, and the Central and Eastern Europeans called it our return to Europe. And for the accession of the Western Balkan countries, the EU puts forward mostly geopolitical and security reasons. And to take a country in order to pacify conflicts, either internally or with neighbors, is of course nothing that you can easily sell to the EU citizens, as long as they do not perceive an imminent threat to the EU itself. And we saw that during the refugee crisis when the Western Balkan countries again came more to the fore and were part of, let's say, public debate in the member states. So I think it will be important which narrative Scotland will be able to establish, and of course also the EU, and how Scotland explains what its essential European interests are. So what will be the likely response to a Scottish accession bid on once it is independent? I think that across the European Union, there will be a broad openness to Scotland wanting to join. So Scotland will not be put politically, not legally, in the same basket with the Western Balkans, not only because it has a far better image, but also in light of the Copenhagen membership criteria, Scotland will look like a bright spot. And I think it will be top of the list of candidates, maybe together with Iceland and other EFTA countries, which could also line up in the future. And I think Brexit here was a real game changer, because Scots were against leaving the European Union, at least a majority. And therefore, many inside the EU can now better understand why Scotland wants to become independent. And in the Brexit context, applying for membership seems plausible, which it was not for many of us before. First Minister Sturgeon presents the narrative of coming home, rejoining the European Union, and claiming that this is a special case that deserves a special treatment. And this might sound like a political moral obligation on the part of the EU to take in an independent Scotland. And I think this narrative has some weaknesses and might not go down so well in all parts of the European Union and also political camps. Many in the EU regret that we lost the UK, but others are not so unhappy about it. The EU can now do things it could not with the UK in. And so questions are, and maybe we have a chance to discuss them, will Scotland follow the British idea of absolute national sovereignty, or the sovereignty idea that many of the Central and Eastern Europeans have, who also recently have gained their independence? Will Scotland claim the opt-outs like the UK did? Will it encourage regionalism and even secessionism in the European Union? And will it be another member state that frequently wants to hold a referendum on EU issues, which is of course risky? So from the EU's point of view, I think there are three sets of issues that will be important with regard to the negotiations. First is the triangular constellation between the rest of the UK, Scotland, and the EU. So while Scotland prepares for independence, the EU wants to build up a new relationship with the whole of the UK. And the EU will want to make sure that there is no negative impact on EU-UK relations throughout all stages of Scottish pre- and post-independence, and as well as pre-accession and accession. And at the same time, the EU will be reluctant to become involved in the bargaining processes between Edinburgh and Westminster when they negotiate the terms of Scotland leaving the EU. And so the EU does not want to import bilateral conflicts and issues. And so I think that Brussels might only give green light to the opening of accession negotiations when there are no loose ends in bilateral negotiations left. The second set of issues concerns the cost-benefit calculation made in the 27 capitals, and they will firstly focus on what it means in economic terms. So will Scotland be a net payer? Will it be a driver of the progressive policies like Green Deal, digitalization, or more the traditional ones? Will it have its own currency and later join the euro? Will it become a NATO member? Will it have all the necessary institutional capacities when it joins? For sure, I would say Scotland will not get the permanent opt-outs the UK had, at least not at treaty level. And the third set of issues concerns the future of Europe. The EU envisions, when you look at the list of candidates, the European Union of approximately 34, 35 countries, even if Scotland will become the 28th member of the Union. And in light of enlargement and also its ambitions to become a strategic actor on the international stage, I think the EU will thoroughly reconsider its integration absorption capacities. And here focus will be on decision-making and further differentiation. So I think when Scotland wants to join, it must be aware that the EU still has not reached a constitutional settlement, and that treaty revisions or some more fundamental reforms could also happen before Scotland eventually joins the European Union. So thank you.
Barbara, thanks very much indeed for that. I'm gratified to see that many of the comments you've made have answered some of the questions that have been posting in the Q&A box as you've been speaking. So it's instant gratification for our audience members as well. Can we move on, please, to our third contribution this evening? And I'm pleased to welcome Professor James Ker-Lindsay to the screen next. James is is a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. He's a member of their LISI research unit, which focuses on Southeast European affairs. That's a region which includes a number of hotspots, including the Western Balkans, Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus. James's research is on conflict, peace, and security in Southeast Europe, on European enlargement, and on secession and recognition in international politics. He is a research associate at the Centre for International Politics at the University of Oxford. And in addition to his academic achievements, he has worked as a consultant at the prestigious Royal United Services Institute and at the arguably less prestigious Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He has appeared regularly in and on the more cerebral organs of the British press and media, and indeed United States as well. James's topic for this evening is lessons from Cyprus and West Balkans accession.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Ronnie, for that. And I just sort of wonder what any colleagues from the Foreign Office, former colleagues, I should say, from the Foreign Office watching might think of your introduction. But also a huge thank you to everyone else for all the organisations for the kind invitation to speak this evening. Yeah, so much valuable information about EU enlargement has already been given that I feel that, a lot of what I'm going to say, would have already been said. So really what I'd like to do is just maybe try and pick out a few important points about the prospect of Scotland joining the European Union that we can draw from the experience of EU enlargement as a whole, and also the EU enlargement experience in Southeast Europe. Now, I remember it was many, many years ago now that one evening I was at a talk in Oxford, and there was an EU enlargement commissioner, and as we were walking over to dinner afterwards, I sort of rather cheekily sort of asked him, look, have you done any planning for an independent Scotland to join the European Union as enlargement commissioner? And he said, no, that would be completely inappropriate. But he said, there was a sense that, this was something that was occasionally spoken about. One couldn't be completely ignorant to the fact that this might have been a possibility and would have been talked about, but certainly was saying, look, it would be completely wrong. As Britain was a member of the European Union, to be discussing that. But of course, nobody would have envisaged a situation that we're in today, at that point anyway, of seeing the United Kingdom out and Scotland seeking to join the European Union in its own right, but completely separate from having Britain as a member within the European Union. So I think that enlargement is fascinating to consider. In terms of specific points that I've raised from Southeast Europe, I think my starting point would be Cyprus. And I think, this was obviously a very, very controversial enlargement issue because of the division of the island. And that's not really the point that I would necessarily make in terms of trying to address where Scotland would be. But I think the point I would say, which is incredibly important because of some of the recent developments we've seen with the agreement of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, is that the EU has always been very clear that it's not up to third countries to decide who can and cannot join the Union. It's always taken a very strong position on this, and we saw this in the case of Cyprus in 2004. This was very problematic because of the division of the island. And Turkey had been making a lot of threats that if Cyprus joins, then it would annex the north of Cyprus, that the European Union would be making a big mistake, it would regret it. And I think to its credit, the European Union, and for good reason, because of course, when Cyprus was joining, we were talking about the 3 Baltic republics. The European Union made a very clear statement to the effect that, look, these countries, whether it be Turkey, whether it be Russia, don't get to choose who joins the European Union and who doesn't. This is a decision for the European Union and the European Union alone. And I think that that's an important point to stress in all this, because, you know, there may be, not necessarily certainly, but there may be certain threatening voices coming out of London sort of saying, you know, this is going to complicate relations and all sorts of things. I'm not saying this is going to be the government position by any stretch. But it will be interesting to see that, you know, I think there would probably be a very negative reaction in certain quarters to this. And I think European Union would want to hold firm on this position that it makes the choice as to who can and can't join. I think another point that very often comes up is the idea that Scotland would have to get in the queue. And I've seen a few people sort of say this, that, you know, well, if Scotland wants to become independent, if it wants to join the European Union, well, it's just going to have to get in line behind the Western Balkans. And there's absolutely no reason to believe that that's the case at all. That's not how EU enlargement works. As Tobias very clearly pointed out, this is a political process, but it's also a legal process. And it's simply a case that the European Union, if you're ready, and there is the political will to take you in, then you join. You don't have to defer that membership behind any other country that might be in advance of you. And I think it's also very clear to point out that nobody in their right mind believes that the political context of an independent Scotland wanting to join the European Union has anything to do with the very complex situation that exists in the Western Balkans. You have a whole range of other problems, very significant post-conflict problems in the Western Balkans, major problems to do with corruption, rule of law. These are not issues that are going to apply to Scotland. And so this idea that somehow the EU just lumps all potential members into a pot and you just work your way through is not accurate. But of course, there will have to be some thinking about how to manage an independent Scotland joining. And I think the point that Barbara sort of brought up about sort of that political will is incredibly important. But I think that in many ways, enlargement has become very problematic politically because of the countries that we're now dealing with. And I work extensively, I travel a lot, well, haven't for the past year for obvious reasons, to the Western Balkans and know them well and have a lot of sympathy for their membership. But I do understand how this is often seen in EU member states. Whereas I think Scotland would naturally fall in a very different position. And in many ways, I think I could see a European Union wanting to take Scotland in to show that enlargement is still something, and it isn't just, and forgive me if there's anyone from the Western Balkans, the crackpot cases from Southeast Europe. That there is something more to this, that it can attract potentially the Iceland, Norway, Switzerland of Northern Europe. And, you know, again, I understand that, you know, that's quite a, you know, potentially insensitive comment to make, but I think most people in the Western Balkans would understand how the European Union is seeing this. I think two small further points that I'd make, well, one small, one fairly large. I think the question of time is important to bear in mind as well. And again, Tobias sort of drew this very interesting differentiation between that enlargement that took in Sweden, Finland, and Austria, and the later one of Croatia. And I think that this is very important. I think, yes, Scotland would have a very fast accession in terms of the negotiation, but I think we also have to be aware of how long ratification can take. And in the case of Croatia, that took the best part of 2 years. Now, it may well be the case that Scotland would be, you know, some sort of fast track process would be made. But it really is worth bearing this in mind, that this is not going to be something that happens overnight. And again, the other point that was made, which is crucial in all of this, is how long Scotland is out before it wants to join again, because every day that it's out, every step that's taken by the United Kingdom to diverge from the EU acquis will mean that these areas which will have to be revisited in that negotiation process. So I think this is something to bear in mind. Now, my final point I'd like to make concerns some of the points that I often hear raised about Kosovo and how that this is going to affect Scottish membership of the European Union, because I often see it said, well, of course, Spain is going to stand in the way of an independent Scotland joining the European Union, because look, look what they do with Kosovo. They're blocking Kosovo from integrating with the European Union. I think it's incredibly important to emphasize here that it will all depend, obviously, on that process of Scottish independence, which would then define how it's treated. And I think it's important to say that Spain is not opposed to independence. Spain has recognized all the countries that have become independent, apart from Kosovo, because of that unilateral declaration of independence from Yugoslavia. It recognized Montenegro when it split from Serbia in 2006. And then looking further afield, it recognized South Sudan along with all the other EU members when it became independent about a decade ago. So it's not that Madrid stands against independence movements. It stands against unilateral secession and processes that don't fall in accordance with constitutional procedures. So I think that this is a really important point to bear in mind. This idea that somehow Scotland would naturally and inevitably face the opposition of Spain and the other EU members that have opposed Kosovo is wrong. And if I might just sort of say on one final point on this, Cyprus, for example, to return back to where I started, would certainly have very, very grave reservations about a Scotland that unilaterally secedes trying to join the European Union. And I just can't see that happening anyway. But in terms of how it would feel about an independent Scotland joining, look, I spent many years on the island, and as someone British, there's a very interesting relationship that exists between the UK and Cyprus. But I think in some ways they'd be rather tickled pink at the thought of having a chance to accept an independent Scotland and getting one back on England. So I certainly have never got the sense that this is something that they would oppose. As I say, I think under the right circumstances, I think they probably take a certain amount of glee at the thought of taking an independent Scotland. Thank you.
Ronnie, your mic's on mute.
Apologies for that less than seamless transition there. James, many thanks to you again. Your very interesting comments have anticipated a number of questions that have already been posted, so many people may feel that they're receive an answer whether their questions are actually quoted at the end, and that's very helpful. Our final contributor is none other than Dr. Kirsty Hughes. Kirsty is the director and founder of the Scottish Centre on European Relations. She is a researcher, a writer, and a commentator on European politics and policy. She's worked at a number of leading European think tanks, including as a senior fellow at the Friends of Europe in Brussels, a senior fellow at the Centre for European Policy Studies, a director of the European Programme at Chatham House, and a senior fellow in the Policy Studies Institute and research fellow at the WZB Berlin Social Sciences Centre. She's published extensively, including books, reports, and policy papers, as well as contributing to a wide range of national and international media outlets. Her research focus has included the UK, Scotland and Brexit, EU democracy, the politics of the Eurozone crisis, the EU enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe, and Turkey's EU accession process. Before I hand the screen to Kirsty, can I just add a personal word about the Scottish Centre on European Relations. I have found their website to be a mine of useful information and impartial comment on the very topics that we're discussing tonight, and indeed on a wide range of similar topics. Kirsty.
Thanks very much, Ronnie. Good evening, everybody. I'm conscious I stand between everybody and I think 63 questions at the moment. And since I agree with almost all that's been said so far, I shall try and disagree with one or two things, just to create a bit of dynamic here. But I will also try to be brief. As very kind of Ronnie to mention our website, we do have a substantial edited report we brought out last March on independence in the EU, and it's got views of 14 different authors. So do take a look at that if you want to deep dive more than tonight. I did just want to start with a positive comment. It's very easy in these debates, and certainly in Scotland, you find in Scotland, or I find, that people rush past the fact that Scotland's been in the EU for 47 years, that currently it's in line with almost all the acquis, and you see, at least on social media, these ferocious debates around the deficit and the currency. And I'm not saying those debates aren't important, but they're not the only debates. And we've heard tonight about the law. We've heard, interestingly, from Barbara and James about the political dynamics, which can be positive or negative. But just stepping back for the bigger picture briefly, European countries come together in the European Union because they want to cooperate together. They don't particularly come together to exclude others. I absolutely agree with Barbara that the attitudes to enlargement have gone up and down over time from different governments and different publics. But in general, the idea of the EU as a pole of attraction is not something that's gone or been lost. And as other speakers have said, I think also there's a lot of sympathy for Scotland. There's more understanding for Scotland now. And so if Scotland were to move more quickly rather than slowly towards independence and the EU, we'd have to see where the politics was at the time. But I think we're talking about a positive European story here. And if Scotland was independent, I very much hope it would choose to rejoin the European Union and not sit on the edges of Europe. So yes, we need to talk about all these tough processes of joining and getting ready and showing you're democratic enough and a market economy enough. But let's not forget that there's some European warmth, if I can put it that way, here as well. I wanted to say something briefly under three main headings. You may not remember Tobias's questions from the start, but they are actually my three headings for his last three questions, which is EU views, borders, and transition. So let me just make a couple of headline points about all of those. I'm not going to repeat what Barbara said in terms of member state attitudes to enlargement. Rather, I wanted to say something about member state attitudes towards independence. Now, obviously, if you talk to any diplomat or government politician, they'll tell you that they'll stay neutral on this issue, that they can't interfere in the constitutional debates and issues of another country. And if you push that a little bit, you'll find different attitudes and also a different level of interest. The EU is a very diverse place, of course, it's 27 member states. It would be a surprise, despite what James just said about Cyprus, it would be a surprise if all those member states were looking positively at the potential for the UK to fragment and break up. Most people I talk to find it an extraordinary prospect. Some find it extraordinary and not very likely from their current point of view. Some find it extraordinary and nonetheless likely. Some see that as more positive than others. And despite all the damage of the Brexit years, I don't find it at all surprising to talk to people related to the French government and find that those two European permanent members of the UN Security Council, that there is not necessarily big support for a fragmentation of the UK. Having said that, if you then say to people, but yes, what if it happens? What if it happens and you've got an independent Scotland, can it rejoin the European Union? Then the attitude switches to pragmatic. Actually, and in some ways it switches to, well, goodness, what would England and Wales be called and what would they do then? And would they keep their UN Security Council seat? But if you're talking about Scotland, it's a 5 million strong North European country that's been in the EU for 47 years, then actually that's seen as relatively straightforward. And that's why I certainly agree with Barbara that if Iceland decided to join after, or Scotland and Iceland, or Norway for that matter, would be at the top of the list. Now, that's not to say that there aren't political issues, and I think the Spain issue is the biggest, and I think one of the most important things to recognise about that concern, and it's been well described by James, is that the other member states are very, very well aware of it. So that if you do, as I did in the autumn, doing interviews across half the member states, if you ask about an independent Scotland, it comes up all the time. So they've got their message across loud and clear. Interestingly, even when I talked to somebody in Prague and said, oh, but what about when Czechoslovakia split into two separate states? The response was, well, I really don't think that's the same, and you just have to look at Spanish concerns. I don't think that means the fact that Spain and essentially all the other member states, for reasons Barbara explained, they're concerned about the relationship with the UK. They don't want that to fall apart. Now we have this hard-gained and hard Brexit treaty. So of course, the member states want to see a legal and constitutionally valid independence process, and they want to see agreement between London and Edinburgh. And it's very hard to see how you would move towards independence on a divorce agreement if you weren't talking between London and Edinburgh. So I think this needs to be taken account of more in the Plan B discussions, but I don't think this necessarily means it has to be done exactly like in 2014. It doesn't necessarily mean London has a permanent veto, but it means that political reality must be faced. Couple of very quick points about borders. Now we have a trade deal. What does this tell us about an independent Scotland in the EU and how it relate to the rest of the UK? I think it tells us a lot. I think now we have that deal. Okay, it might change in future, but it means there is a basis to analyse the potential costs and benefits in terms of the impact on rest of UK-Scottish economic relations, the impact of independence in that sense. The Scottish-English border would become the external border of the European Union. And we've seen already just in the last few days, big and small companies being very shocked at the level of bureaucratic and non-tariff barriers they now face. So while some of that may ease as companies get used to those processes, that's going to stay overall and it will have a negative economic cost. So an independent Scotland would have a harder border with the UK, well, rather with England and Wales, because of course Northern Ireland is in the single market for goods, but it would then have an open border again with the EU 27 or 28 as it would be if it had joined. And there is one part of that where an independent Scotland would actually hopefully be in a win-win situation, because if Ireland and the rest of the UK agreed, it would stay in the common travel area, but at the same time it would have free movement of people in the EU, so it would benefit from both sides of that. I think services is a more interesting question, and there's a big question there, given that services are so thinly covered in the trade deal. There's a question of whether and in which service sectors the rest of the UK and Scotland could negotiate a bilateral agreement to try and cause less damage to trade that a hard border might impose. Very briefly, on my third topic on transition, Now that the UK has left the EU, it's left its customs union, it's left the single market, there is no seamless way for Scotland to stay in the EU. It will have to reapply. It's not the same situation as 2014. And I think, again, now we have this trade agreement, we have to look very carefully at what would be best for an independent Scotland. It's not obvious that immediately and rapidly negotiating an association agreement, which is the normal path to membership, before you get through all the negotiations that Barbara and James and Tobias have talked about. Before that, you need an association agreement so you can start to take down trade barriers and start to align. But if you think of it, when might Independence Day be? How long is a piece of string? But when might there be a referendum or an independence decision? How long would the divorce take? If you got, say at the very earliest, if you got to independence in 2024, by then you'd have had 3 years of this new EU-UK trade deal. It's not obvious to me that leaving that trade deal on day one is necessarily the smoothest transition. You might need a transition just like the UK had out of the EU, i.e. staying in its single market and trade deal for a while. Now, to do that, you'd have to talk to the EU and the rest of the UK and get their agreement. And this is where I maybe just very slightly disagree with Barbara. And she said that the EU will stand back from talks between London and Edinburgh. And I think on the whole, that's true. But if you think, on day one of independence, what are you going to do about fishing waters? And what's the impact on the UK-EU trade deal? So actually, even if Scotland isn't yet an independent state or a third country, you're going to have some informal and quite complex three-way talks, it seems to me, to get through that. So I think what you don't want is an independent Scotland, even just for a few months. You don't want to have put up borders to the rest of the UK and not taken them down to the EU. So I think there's a longer discussion to have about that and how to handle that transition. There's a longer discussion to have about currency and deficits as well. But I think for now, as we're running out of time and let's get on to the now 76 questions, I had better leave it there. Thank you very much.
Kirsty, thank you very much for that. And thanks for noticing the time. I'm somewhat daunted at the thought of doing justice to all these questions. I'm going to try and lump some of them together and see how far we get and prioritize the more popular ones. The first one is an anonymous question about timescale. Tobias had something to say about this, and I know that you've written on it, Kirsty, so I'm going to direct this question to Barbara and to James, and ask them each to comment on this. And please be willing to sacrifice completeness for the sake of brevity, if you will. The question really is realistic timescale from the date of an independence reference, an independence referendum where Scotland votes to leave the United Kingdom. Perhaps I could ask you just to factor in an estimate for the amount of time it would take to negotiate a separation settlement with the United Kingdom government. In the Scottish Government's white paper in November 2013, they allowed 18 months for that. So it was an 18-month period from the date of the referendum to Independence Day. You can take that as you find it, but with the usual caveats and with a couple of years perhaps either way. Barbara, can you give us your best shot, first of all, about a time scale?
Yes, acoustics are very bad, but I think I got your question.
Yeah.
From the date of independence, of course, we will first have a year or so for the whole of the screening process and getting everything ready, and then negotiations might start if everything runs smoothly. There are no external interventions, etc. And then I think we should estimate around 3 years or so for the negotiations. And then, of course, what always follows is ratification, which normally takes 2 years. We now have a situation that we have a lot of changes in government in member states, so it's sometimes not for political reasons that there are delays and not a very swift process, but just because it's for more formal or technical reasons. So that makes a period of time of, I'd say, at least 7 years.
All right. Thank you. James?
I'd be tempted to go for a shorter time frame, a considerably shorter time frame. I think the key thing, and maybe this is where Tobias can come in as the lawyer, is it would really come down to whether it would be possible to negotiate exit from the UK at the same time as entry to the EU. If that can be done, and assuming there hasn't been significant divergence from the acquis, then one could potentially see a relatively fast process. The problem is, of course, is that you've got to transpose into domestic law the elements of the acquis. And that would create a very strange legal situation as to whether the UK government would allow, in the process of negotiating independence, the Scottish Parliament to essentially be, almost from day one, essentially passing a Section 30 order on practically every issue, except for maybe foreign affairs and defence. But even then, part of joining the European Union requires aligning on foreign and security policy. So there's a lot of complication that comes into this. This is not as straightforward. But I could definitely see if you can find workarounds, and the EU, even though it is very legal, does have a lot of political latitude to be able to work in these ways. I think you could be talking a much faster process, but I think really we wouldn't. It would probably have to be 3 years at a minimum. 4 years probably more likely on an optimistic scale. But it certainly could be 7 years. That's the thing. But I'd certainly lean towards everything aligning right. It could be done, faster.
You're on mute, Ronnie.
Thanks. We've had a lot of questions about currency. This is a big deal, and I'm tempted to ask each of you to give us perhaps a minute maximum on this. The first question on currency was from Roderick McMillan, where he says, could we close Chapter 17 of the acquis on monetary policy while using the pound, as we wouldn't govern monetary policies such as interest rates, etc. Now, there have been other questions on currency. I think it's fair to say that the general focus is on whether it would be a requirement for an independent Scotland to take up the euro. In that regard, there was an interesting question citing the Danish and Swedish experiences. And then there are questions which are directed to the issue of whether Scotland could have its own currency and still accede. Now, I know that's a lot of ground to cover in a very short time, but it is a pressing issue as far as many people are concerned. So if I can ask each of you in turn, perhaps, to give us your most succinct views on these the currency condition for accession. And if I could start with Tobias on this.
Okay, that's a tricky one. So the reason Denmark doesn't have the euro is because Denmark has a legal opt-out. The reason Sweden hasn't got the euro is because Sweden does not have an opt-out, but they simply haven't taken the steps to become an EU member state, because a euro state, a euro currency country. Because the way it works is that you commit to adopting the euro as a currency, as an accession country, and then there are certain stages of the European economic and monetary union, which require the cooperation of the state joining. So Sweden simply isn't cooperating on this, and nobody seems to be pressing them on it. And that's the reason they are not part of the euro, and they probably won't be. Can Scotland do the same? I think the argument is sometimes, okay, we may have to commit to euro membership, but we're simply not going to do it. So what are they going to do about it? That is certainly an option, but you shouldn't say it out loud while negotiating. That's probably a bad idea. But the other thing about the pound as a currency is an interesting one, and I don't have an answer. I only know that if you want to adopt the euro, you have, at some stage, you'll have to join the European exchange rate mechanism. And I don't see how you can do that if you don't have your own currency. But I don't know enough about economics and monetary policy.
Thank you. Barbara, please.
Yes, not on the on this aspect. I think Kirsty knows that better. You have to join the exchange rate mechanism, and it's really a unique case that a country could join without its own currency. We never had that before, and so maybe the EU is up to do something more innovative than before. I don't know, but apart from that, it's difficult to set a bad example to pretend that you commit yourself to an objective that is in the primary law, and then you find ways around it like Sweden does. I think that's not, I would not recommend that, but one has to be aware that when you're not part of the third stage of the monetary union, you also miss what some see as the political core. We don't know how the EU will develop over the next decades. And I would not rule out that we have a push towards a more differentiated core Europe. And then those who are not inside the Euro group, they miss it.
Thank you, Barbara. James, can you offer something on this?
Yeah, I think two brief points. First, I'm fascinated by this currency debate in the whole Scotland independence, European Union discussion, because it just, and I realise I'm treading on very sensitive ground here, but it almost strikes me that is Scotland ready for independence if it's not willing to ditch the pound? I really fully realise what I've just said and how sensitive that is, but it does strike me as extraordinary that the rest of the European Union, and maybe this is the legacy of decades of anti-European hostility in these British Isles, that Scotland it seems so hung up on this issue, rather than saying, yes, of course we'll want to join the Euro, because this is part of what being a member of the European Union effectively means now. And I think that point that Barbara just made about being in that inner circle is incredibly important. But there is a very important practical issue here that does need to be thought about, which is what is that intermediate step then? Of how would Scotland join the Euro if it doesn't have its own currency? Now, given everything I've just said, this is actually a very interesting discussion because, of course, Kosovo and Montenegro have unilaterally Euroized, and that's a horribly difficult phrase to get across. It's a real tongue twister, but essentially they've taken on the Euro without permission and use it as their national currency. Now, Kosovo, we know that there's all sorts of other problems standing in the way, but Montenegro is at the moment the leading candidate for joining the European Union. It uses the Euro, but it completely off its own back and isn't structured. And I don't think anyone really quite knows how to deal with that situation. So there is a fascinating possibility that if they can find a way of work around that, if that happens before Scotland joins, then maybe the answer is for Scotland to unilaterally Euroize as a way of dealing with this problem. But otherwise, yes, I mean, it's a whole big issue, which is incredibly complicated.
James, thank you very much. Kirsty.
Yes, very briefly, I agree with what's been said so far. The question, can you close the chapter in the negotiations, basically on monetary policy without your own currency? I think this is very problematic. I don't think it's quite as problematic as I thought it was a couple of years ago when I was reading the Growth Commission report that suggested the sterlingization policy. But obviously you can't meet the criteria is laid out. You can't treat your exchange rate as a matter of concern, common concern. You can't target price stability. The idea of the policy as set out in the Growth Commission report is that you do eventually move to your own Scottish currency. And it's interesting listening to Barbara sort of think aloud about whether there might be what she called an innovative response. I've talked to one or two people in Brussels who again have said, well, that would be unprecedented. And so it's then a political decision what you do about it. And what's possible, but by no means likely, is imagine if you had negotiations for 4 or 5 years, and that perhaps in another 2 years, Scotland was planning to bring in its own currency. Would it have to wait those extra 2 years to show that the EU had got its own currency? Or could it come in with a credible transition from the pound to its own currency? So once it was already inside the European Union. So I think that's one possible issue. But I agree with everybody else. And as James says, you know, there's such a negative discussion around the euro here. People all the time like to compare Scotland to Ireland, but Ireland chose to be a core member of the European Union and to join the euro. And actually, I mean, one of the reasons for sterlingization, I think, is partly fear about what would happen to a Scottish currency if the exchange rate might fall or pensions might be damaged. And with the euro, that wouldn't happen. Just wanted to underline one other point that people have also to some extent made. It's not going to look great. I mean, it's already there in the discussion, and I understand why. But, oh, well, we could commit to the euro, but we don't have to join it, don't worry. People in Brussels and the rest of the EU are listening, and they may be open to Scotland, as we've discussed tonight. They are not open, not after the last 4.5 years, to a mini Britain, you know, another country that wants its own special cake and eat it and all the rest of it. So I think this discussion about currency and the euro needs to be more European, basically. Thank you.
Kirsty, thank you very much for that. I want to move to another popular theme in the questions that we've had, and I know that you've all touched on the realpolitik, on the question of achieving unanimity amongst EU members in relation to the accession and certain political sensitivities. But if I can direct you first of all to a question from Sheila, which hits the bullseye on this, and then I'm broadening out a wee bit. Her question is it likely that Spain would veto Scotland's accession to the EU in light of the Catalonia issue? And then if you bear with me a wee bit here, we had then a question from Derek Young. Much of the debate pro-Brexit about a prospective independent Scotland accession focused on the need for unanimity amongst the other member states, with the implication that other states might be reluctant to agree and ratify, as it could encourage other separatist movements inside their own countries. To that extent, do the panelists believe this might still apply? And then finally, we had a question from Etienne Duval, very much along the same lines, where Spain was mentioned, but also France and the Flemish issue. So we have, each of you, I think, have acknowledged this as an issue. Are you prepared to stick your neck out a bit and say whether you think there is a real possibility that one or other of these sensitivities would either block or seriously delay Scottish accession? We've only really got 5 or 6 minutes left for further questions. Can you each just give me your best shot on that as briefly as you can? Again, I'll go, if I may, first to Tobias.
Thanks. I'll stick with a legal answer on that. I think what counts is for the EU is that Scottish independence is achieved in a way that it is recognized internationally. If that happens, that's fine. Then the doors are open. You can see that with Kosovo, I think, you know, whether that's through a unilateral declaration, which probably won't be recognized internationally that easily, or through the process that we would have had after 2014, or through an alternative process. Doesn't matter. But as long as it's recognized internationally, it's fine. But I think that can't happen without the consent of the UK to the process at some point, I think.
You're muted, Ronnie.
Thanks. Barbara, please.
I agree with Tobias. I would just add that nevertheless, there will be some debates about it. I would say that it's important that the Scottish political parties very much engage with their European counterparts to talk about, let's say, what are the motives for Scottish independence. And I know that before Brexit really happened, we talked about Catalonia and Scotland very much in one and the same agenda. But now I think there is a chance to really decouple the Scottish question from the Catalonia question, but there should be an effort to explain better what the reasons, the drivers of independence are, and what the idea of a Scottish nation is. I think that is very, very important, because on the continent there is, I think, not a lot of knowledge about these issues. Yep.
Thank you, Barbara. And as more than one of you have mentioned, we do have a track record of 47 years of successful membership, and it wasn't Scotland that brought that to an end. James, please.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is obviously, as I said, I tried to touch on this a little bit, that, Spain's position is very much, it opposes what it considers unilateral secession. I actually was looking through some of the comments, and there was a very interesting question, which I think is worth addressing, because this is a debate that's coming up at the moment of whether the Scottish elections in May this year can be a stand-in for a referendum on independence. And I think the key thing, and this is a message that I know is not going to be necessarily particularly popular, it doesn't matter. What matters is that essentially the United Kingdom permits Scotland to become independent. And I'm aware of the weighted tone of that in this particular audience and in Scotland. But, I look at secession and recognition, and, wherever my sympathy lies, and I stand full square behind Scotland having the right to a new choice, I also have to recognise, and I deal with all sorts of disputes of this type across the world, that this is just the way it works, that Scotland would need to be internationally recognised and in actual fact a member of the UN. And of course that would be blocked by the rest of the United Kingdom if this was a unilateral move. And it's not entirely clear in EU circles whether it's even possible to join the European Union unless you're a member of the United Nations, because that brings all sorts of obligations, membership parties to all sorts of treaties and things that the EU now, as an actor and as member states, are involved in. So it's an incredibly complex question, but essentially there's no getting around this, I'm sad to say in many ways, but it will take a dialogue with London to make sure that this is constitutionally done if you want to get past a lot of these obstacles.
Thank you very much, James. And Kirsty, the last word on this.
Well, very briefly, I think everyone's saying the same thing, really. There has to be dialogue and in the end, agreement between London and Edinburgh. And I think, it's general in accession negotiations that Brussels and the EU ask candidates to make sure they've got as good relations as possible with their neighbours. And I can see, James is nodding. It's terribly important and for obvious reasons difficult in the Western Balkans. And I think there needs to be more consideration of what that's conceivably going to look like. You've got the special protocol for Northern Ireland. Imagine now, under the terms of the current EU-UK trade deal, that you have an independent Scotland in the EU. So you're leaving England and Wales completely outside, Northern Ireland half in, half out, if there hasn't been an Irish referendum by then. What do you want relations to look like? you know, if you're in favour of independence in the EU. What's your take on that? How do you see the island working together? And we've heard SNP politicians talk about Scotland as a bridge, but I think that has to be fleshed out quite a lot more.
Very interesting. Well, realistically, I'm afraid that looks like all the questions that we've got time for. I hope, as I mentioned earlier, that any disappointed questioners will have found some of the answers we're looking for in the excellent talks that we had from each of our 4 speakers. And with that, I'll simply hand you back to Mark.
Well, thank you, Ronnie. I also, on behalf of European Movement Scotland, thank our speakers. Thank you, Ronnie, for moderating the event, and obviously our sponsors, the Faculty of Advocates and the Scottish Centre on European Relations. Thank you to all those who've been participating. I think we had almost 450 people taking part in the event today, which is excellent, not surprising in the topic, but also it's been a great event. Obviously, as an organisation, we do hold debates like this, webinars to take part in the important debates about Scotland's future within Europe, but we're also a membership organisation. We're a campaigning organisation as well. So if you're interested in what we're doing, if you support what we're doing, whatever your view is on the Constitution or whatever your political party, if any, you're welcome in the European Movement in Scotland, and you will get our website in the slide at the end of this session. We are part of a European Movement International. So those of you who are watching from other countries, please think about joining the European Movement in your country, including, of course, the European Movement UK, in which we play our part as well. Have a look also at our website for information and dissection of Brexit and the effects, which we have a lot of expert input on our website, which we also would recommend to you, even if you don't necessarily want to join us. So thank you again to our speakers. Thank you all for participating tonight. And as I said, in a few minutes, you should get a survey, which should be very grateful indeed if you take part and sign. And finally, we have a petition at the moment supporting our pledge for Scotland to be part of the European Union in some way in the future. That again will be, I think, on the slide at the end. Thank you again. So please think about joining and supporting that pledge as well. Thank you again to our speakers. Good night to you all.